Yeah, what's with all the high up priests dressed like pimps and all that? Anyway, sorry.
Like pimps.
You will never create that movement online because people who are online are not there to do activism. They're just not. People who are hanging out in Discord servers are there for entertainment because that's what it is. And that's the problem with all political entertainment, whether it's Chapo Trap House or, Dave Rubin or Sam Cedar, or even people I very much enjoy like Jimmy Dore. That there may be a value to it. I'm not going to deny that there's no like value to getting people to think about these issues in a different way. But that's not where the movement will come from. I don't think any kind of movement.
My dear and lovely and beautiful audience, it's Nietzsche's world and we just living in it. And that's because today my guest is Keegan, and I'm going to pronounce his last name quietly because I'm not sure how to do it. Kjeldsen. But Keegan is from the band Destroyer of Light, and he created the Nietzsche Podcast, which is one of the best resources online for learning about Nietzsche, since Keegan has this easy, relaxed manner, and he's well versed in Nietzsche in a very practical and Nietzschean way, since his music has this strongly Dionysian element to it, like it's this punchy metal, and a link to their hit song Into the Smoke, which we talk about in the podcast. The question I asked myself for this episode is, how does Nietzsche's thought translate into building communities? It's not an easy thing to answer because Nietzsche is so hard to pin down and extract normative behavior from. So, we spend a lot of time unpacking an aphorism, for example. I really enjoyed my conversation, and I hope you do too. The episode name that I'm thinking is The Church of Nietzsche, right? Because,
because I'm his St. Paul.
You kind of,
St. Paul.
I do think of you as something like that. I mean, not to blow too much smoke up your rear, but your podcast
it's almost an insulting comparison that we're making.
Because he hated
was
Paul,
a terrible guy.
right? And he ruined Christianity, I guess, in Nietzsche's eyes.
Oh, that's true. Nietzsche didn't like Paul. Yeah, that's right. But sorry. Well, I mean, yeah, no, I see the comparison. Because you could say that Jesus had many. Well, the way Nietzsche interprets Jesus, and a few people have come to interpret him in recent times as having like esoteric teachings. You could say that Paul made it exoteric. He took all of this hippie nonsense about the kingdom of God being within you and said, no, okay, we're going to have these celibacy rules, and we're going to have this, that, and the other, we're going to codify like what exactly it was that happened with Jesus's incarnation. And so, yeah, he took something that was sort of mysterious and open to interpretation, and sort of Jesus's like gift to all people, and made it something institutional. So hopefully I'm not doing that, but he did. The parallel is in terms of making it, what would you say? Laying it out in a easily digestible, codified manner, you could say.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but one irony of Nietzsche that I think he sometimes alludes to explicitly is that sometimes when he attacks people viciously, it's like a way of honoring their ideas, because if he didn't care about them or think that they were worth thinking about, he just wouldn't bring it up in his text. But then to me, the fact that he like really starts throwing darts at Paul, like he just tears him apart like from every possible angle, right? He just like calls him just like a total loser, and he like describes like the whole like crucifixion as a Jewish imbroglio, like this really like cutting language. But then to me, in some of Paul's writings, his project is almost like an inverted image of what Nietzsche is trying to do, and that like Paul is explicitly trying to flip the world on its head, to make the weak strong, to make nothing something. And Nietzsche is almost like taking that, which, has kind of in has kind of taken over the culture, right? Of like, we have to be kind and gentle, and we have to direct our attention away from strength and aggression. And Nietzsche's like, no, that stuff is actually really empowering, and by doing a disservice to that master morality, we're actually like castrating half of what makes humanity really beautiful. And so his project is almost like Pauline in that sense, where it's like this very ambitious way of casting a totally different perspective on all of reality, really.
Yeah.
So
I would also think of his what his first untimely meditation. Yeah. About David Strauss. You would first notice, if you read that a lot of what David Strauss is concerned with and what he's saying in David Strauss's work, I forget the name of the book that Nietzsche was criticizing. It's very similar to like Nietzsche's own concerns.
Okay.
And it's just not readily apparent, like where you think, okay, my first salvo in the cultural criticism I'm going to make against Germany, and it's somebody who's really similar to Nietzsche in many ways.
Dude, like when I was going through that, I'm like, dude, that's you. When you're like, when he's criticizing him, I'm like, that's what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and he's even, I would say there's important differences, but they're mostly obtained with later Nietzsche. Early Nietzsche is very similar to David Strauss. And then of course, there's the quote that I love. It's from Nietzsche's notebooks. Socrates is, to confess it frankly, so close to me that almost always I fight a fight against him. Basically revealing that it's because I feel so close to you, and that I don't even want to really elaborate too much more on that saying, because it contains everything, right? The personal, the personality, ideas, his role in culture, all those things, that I have to fight against you and criticize you, which, I mean, it reveals an important thing about what Nietzsche is doing with his criticism. It's not just knocking things down. So the other reason why he says, I've negated as no one's negated before without ever becoming a no-saying spirit, or however he puts it, or while still being a yes-saying spirit. I forget which way he says it, but that's an ecce homo. And so a lot of his negation and his attacks are very constructive, because they're aimed at things that, like you said, they only have a right to his criticism because there's some truth in them.
I mean, that thing about kind of having someone lodged in your head and constantly arguing with them, I relate to that a lot, and I feel like sometimes I might bring that person up in conversation, and I just have like all these things ready to like attack them on, but that's only because they're so important to me. That's not because I think that they're like an awful person. And so for me, someone like that would be Jordan Peterson. Like, I spent so much time arguing with him in my own head, right? And even being angry at what he said. So for example, one of the things that he said that really set me off was that separation of church and state is a miracle. Like, that drove me up the walls. I'm like, you're wrong. You can't say that. But I mean,
why is that? I'm interested in what your beef with that statement is.
Well, it's how can I say it politely? Like, it's
don't
like,
say it politely.
It's just like, it's so it's glib, and it destroys the meaning of miracles in the way it's normally used.
Oh, right. But Jordan Peterson does that with the divine in general. And it was interesting because I had always assumed, because when I admit Jordan Peterson gave me a new appreciation for religious grounding that I didn't really comprehend even reading Nietzsche, because Jordan Peterson actually, I think, gets a lot of his grounding from like the Western religious tradition. So I always assumed that he would be beloved by the beleaguered Christians who are losing their hold on society, right? But I remember he talked with Bishop Barron, and the way Bishop Barron he's like a conservative commentator bishop, if the audience isn't familiar with him. Like, he used to appear on Fox News a lot. He's got a YouTube channel. But the several things he said were almost kind of like subtly reminding Jordan Peterson, like, but you're not really one of us. I can't. Nothing comes to mind immediately, but he was sort of talking about Jordan Peterson, like, of course you're like an outsider to the faith, kind of, because of course he's not, strictly speaking, a confirmed Catholic, and more to the point, he does secularize the divine, or what would you say? He's done such a good job of like explaining how everything in like the book of Genesis, for example, can be squared with like evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, that it kind of does eliminate all the magic and all of the supernatural metaphysical stuff from it. He's so invested in that Carl Jung approach, and that seeing all these allegories and moral lessons in the psychology of the Bible, that it takes out the fact that they're like, this is a book about a metaphysical battle for the souls between God and Satan, that like is the most important decision you'll make in your life. Like that's what like a true Christian would have to say. So I don't know.
I'm wondering if we're thinking of the same person when you mentioned Bishop Barron, because I remember Peterson had a conversation with somebody who was dressed, maybe it was a cardinal, I don't know, but it was like a very
like, this probably was him,
fancy attire. And
did he have like a kind of like a gaudy like cross on?
I think so, but yeah, something gaudy. It was like jewelry and like very beautiful like clothes.
Yeah, what's with all the high up priests dressed like pimps and all that? Anyway, sorry.
Like pimps. Yeah, no, it's strange. Although I do appreciate the fact that they have like, they have an appreciation for color as like a symbol and stuff like that. But one of the really frustrating things to me about that interview was that Jordan seemed to be genuinely interested in like a critical appraisal of like the Bible. And he even brought up, he brought up something like what you said, where he said, the evolutionary perspective is something that like blows open a whole can of worms when it comes to like, what does this book mean, right? Because if we understand its historical circumstances, going back millions of years, right, as he does with, the snake and everything, like, what does that mean for us? Like, how can we evaluate it in the light of this new scientific knowledge? And then the guy, like the bishop or whatever, he does this really sneaky move where he's like, all that evolution stuff, like, that's not really that important. What we're really interested in is like something spiritual. And then he starts like quoting these like really like dense and like dense and like airy fairy language from Hegel. That's like it's something that I don't know, to me it's like a rhetorical trick. It's like, oh, like this like really mysterious saying about like spirituality and divinity, without really getting to terms with like how difficult it is to like keep the same ideas while like acknowledging evolution. And I feel like Jordan is having a hard time like finding somebody like him, because he's so highly educated. Like, he's read so much stuff that it's hard for him to like believe the same stuff. And he even mentions like he doesn't go to church. He doesn't feel like it's like got the same impact on him.
And he says he doesn't go to therapy.
Oh, I know that.
There was a Q&A. I don't remember the source for this, but I remember he said, because somebody asked, have you been to therapy? And he said, well, his answer involved something to the effect of, it's a really bad thing if you can outthink your therapist. Basically saying, I have never found a therapist smarter than me, which is kind of a brag, but I can imagine it's a real problem. I mean, if you have serious mental issues, just like Nietzsche says, every sort of like little drive and subpersonality has its own logic. So like if you're suffering from anxiety and you're really smart, that anxiety drive, or whatever we want to call it, the part of you that gets anxious, that is telling you the million what ifs about everything that can go wrong, is going to really smartly subvert all of your risk mitigation where you're like, oh, well, that can't go wrong. I took this precaution. And then your anxiety brain says, no, 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 there's still that 0.1% chance that this could go wrong. And let me explain to you how. And, if you can outthink your therapist, I can imagine it would probably be pretty tough. But the bigger thing is that Jordan Peterson, seems to advise people to, I don't know, not necessarily go to therapy, but be willing to trust in the expertise of people who have spent a lot of time on their field. Be willing to reconcile yourself with society and its institutions, become part of the broader culture and its traditions. So you would think he would be cool with going to church or seeing a therapist if you have a problem. Instead he got hooked on benzos. But
well, that's something fun. I've been wondering. You're I don't know the statistics of your you're freezing up, but
I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, your podcast. Let's say that you get 1 million followers or a million listeners. I wonder how
Please.
That would. What's that?
Please.
Yeah, hopefully. How that would change your approach, right? Because I'm thinking if I was in Jordan's position and he has millions and millions of people watching him, and it puts so much pressure on you to give advice that's meant for a large variety of people. And what you mentioned about integrating yourself into society, I felt uncomfortable with that when I was reading Jung, where his message seemed to be so explicitly geared towards getting married, getting a good job, being a stable functioning member of society. And part of me is oh, that's a little dreary, right? But then I think, well, it needs to happen. It would be nice if we just got everyone to that level, right? Which is actually for all its mundanity, it's quite a task, right? It's not easy for people to integrate themselves. It's not easy for them to connect with other people, to get married, to have kids, to keep a stable job. That's a lot of hard work, right? And when I was a teenager, I thought oh, I'm just going to be a rogue independent artist. I'll find my own way, only to realize you kind of have to learn the rules before you break them in some cases, right? It was for me to earn enough.
It's jazz.
Right. Jazz musicians weren't just forget learning music, man. Maybe somewhere, piano, yeah. Right?
Right. But even if they didn't learn theory, you learn music, right? Before you're a great jazz musician. I get that vibe from Jung and Peterson as well, and I do think it's useful. From another angle, it seems stuffy and boring because we're from the West and it's Christianity and tradition, but that's kind of the message of Lao Tzu. Just see the beauty in mundanity and know that it's the weaker things and the softer things that eventually overcome the hardest. And it's the things that are in the background that are really important. So that's a way of reconciling yourself to there's a great passage in the Zhuangzi, which is another Taoist text about Butcher Ting is his name. And the king comes by and is basically just praising this butcher for how he, he finds his Tao while he's cutting meat, basically. And I've always seen there is a really deep sort of content there about flow states and using negative space to your advantage. But I think on some level, from a sociological angle, there's social utility to disseminating that teaching of see the beauty in just being a meat cutter, disseminating that idea to the masses of you can find this mastery even in these mundane jobs or in the art of being a father or a family man or a husband or something like that. So I don't think it's bad. If it's repackaged in a certain way, I think it could be pretty popular. And it is popular with Jordan Peterson, actually, so I don't know what I'm saying. But I don't know how much he actually translates to people actually doing that is the other thing. Because maybe all of his talk about taking responsibility is very popular because people find that very hard to do. And I wonder how many people are out there watching Jordan Peterson videos about taking responsibility while not doing it because that's a lot easier. And I think that's kind of the fundamental problem really with like self-help and people of that stripe.
Have you ever seen that Simpsons episode with they make up this like self-help guru called Brad Goodman, and he tells people to like get in touch with their inner child, and Bart just says like he does what he feels like, and everyone in town starts to do that, and it all like kind of collapses.
I think I vaguely remember that. Is this like first like early Simpsons, like first 10 seasons?
Yeah.
I think I vaguely remember that, but I don't have a good memory of that episode.
Anyway, like
but not everyone should act like Bart.
Right. Yeah. And then at the end, Lisa says like, Dad, like, don't you realize like self-help isn't something that, you know, you just attend a conference for. It's like a lifetime of like hard work and self-reflection. And then Homer says like, oh yeah, that's what I've been saying all along. Everyone's fine just the way they are. Like this completely like ridiculous. But like, yeah. Like what's interesting too is like, Jordan mentions this, and it's all through his comments, at least like when I was watching his videos a lot. Like people say, you know, like this guy's changed my life for the better. And it like, I think it's probably true. Like, I found him to be helpful, just like as a pick me up, right? Just he has a way of like really getting through to people. He's a very good, very talented speaker. But then of course I'd want to know like how long that effect lasts.
Yeah. Well,
right?
he's a preacher. Most people need a preacher.
I like that.
And we don't have that now in secular society. And so, I mean, I often joke because this is another figure that I enjoy as well. But it's funny how they correlate with like almost, you could say like left-wing brain, right-wing brain in some sense. It's like if you need a preacher, father figure, spiritual guide, and you're a young secular man in the West, you can go for Alan Watts or you can go for Jordan Peterson, basically. You have your cool hippie dad or your stern clean your room dad. And they both, I think there's probably a lot of overlap of people who can enjoy both of them. But
guilty as charged.
Yeah, for real. Right here. But you have to recognize like what that is. Whenever I recommend somebody like listen to something by Alan Watts or Jordan Peterson, it's when they're like deeply depressed. So I'm sure he has helped people because like sometimes you just need somebody who like, you know, talks for a long time in a really beautiful way about a lot of the things that you're dealing with. And that's what they're, I think, good for. The problem is like when it becomes like a whole ideology and like shaping your identity around it, that becomes a little weird. And because that's how you get stuck in that self-help rut, I think, is where you get addicted to basically like, rather than fixing the problem, you get addicted to like the medicine of like,
I like that.
the pretty words.
I feel like that. I was like that with Watts. But yeah, like one of the things that I found Watts really helpful for was like, I was on this, kind of like binge of depression, like suicidal ideation, and he didn't take the tack of like, no, like that's the wrong thing to think, like you need to get help. He was actually like, oh well, that's an interesting idea, let's think about it, right? And then he had all these cool like stories about how, you know, different like cultures see life like from the East, and it's not like entirely against, like he had this, yeah, like a hippie sort of non-moralistic approach of just like whatever go, like everything's cool, man, right? That sort of thing. And it was like such a relief for me. But yeah, like I would just like listen to his stuff over and over again because it was just like comforting to hear him talk rather than maybe like actually growing like my own life and in my own direction kind of.
Right. Well, and I think part of that is that on some level, you shouldn't beat yourself up over that because you might just need like a long gestation period. The other thing too, when you were saying that, I was like, yeah, and Alan Watts has a really pleasing, like, sounding voice. You know, he's British, and he's got a very just pleasant way of speaking. And then I was kind of thinking about Jordan Peterson, who I'm like, his voice is actually a little grating. And so it's kind of even more impressive that on the strength of his, like, just the content of his ideas, he's somehow become the superstar that he is. And he did it while alive. Alan Watts, I mean, I know he was like popular and everything, but he's definitely reached more people after being dead than he ever did when he was alive. Because you look at some of the top like Watts clips and it's millions and millions and millions of people. So we're in this age now where like we are in a very intellectually fecund age. As much as it seems shallow and superficial and like bleak, ideas are being shared on a level they never have been. And so it's good to have, I mean, a lot of the cynical intellectual people like me are always very down on social media and have like a Luddite streak, but it's important to like see the positive of it. So
yeah, I remember hearing somewhere that to be considered a bestseller, you need to sell something like 10,000 copies of a book, which in terms of, viewers on a YouTube video is like nothing, right? And Jordan was saying this too, like he could turn on his camera and then have a speech that would be instantly seen by 1 million people, right? Which would be like have such incredible impact beyond almost like any political leader. Like it's his influence
like
is
ever,
right?
Basically throughout time, which is kind of crazy. Except maybe like the Bible and like some of the books that he talks about,
right?
So
okay, so maybe we could get into this aphorism from the Gay Science. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. So I feel nervous to say like the whole thing. I'll maybe just like highlight the parts that I found
too evil.
Not even too evil, but it's like weird for me to just like pause and like do a paragraph of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
But like, and also it
Quote
is
the
like
key sentences.
Yeah, it is kind of an extreme thing to say. But I like when I read it initially, it made me laugh out loud. It was like that relief of hearing someone say stuff like this, just to get it out there, to think about it. So this aphorism is called "On the Lack of Noble Manners," and so he begins by saying that culture that is that rests on a military basis still towers above so-called industrial culture, because you're at the mercy of brute need and you have to sell yourself and you'll end up despising people who exploit that. And then he says, submission to powerful, frightening, even terrible persons like tyrants and generals is not experienced as nearly so painful as is this submission to unknown and uninteresting persons, which is what all the luminaries of industry are. What the workers see in the employer is usually only a cunning, blood-sucking dog of a man who speculates on all misery, and the employer's name, shape, manner, and reputation are a matter of complete indifference to them. The masses are willing to submit to slavery of any kind if only the higher-ups constantly legitimize themselves as higher, as born to command, by having noble manners. The most common man feels that nobility cannot be improvised, and that one has to honor it in the fruit of long periods of time. And then he goes on to say that if people get the idea that those who are at the top are just there by accident, then well, why not me, sort of thing. And so I was like, yeah, maybe I could get your impressions on that, or how you might have read it.
Well, because I remember you said to me like that it was like antagonistic to seeing society, or it was critical of seeing society as characterized by class antagonism. Would you say that's a good?
Like
that's the essence of that particular passage, but we could definitely say that that's an element of Nietzsche's political opinion throughout his career. So I like that element's there in that passage. But what I focus on more is, so it's very interesting the way he says it, right? Because he is saying if the lower classes, the workers, perceive that it's just anybody who can hold power, then of course they're going to be spurned on to revolution, or they'll be led to think of revolution as legitimate, however you would put it. But it's interesting. So in this passage, I have it pulled up here. And you did read this. Well, and I think I have a different translation, but he says, it's probable that the manufacturers and the great magnates of commerce have hitherto lacked too much all those forms and attributes of a superior class. If they had the nobility of the nobly born in their looks and bearing, there would perhaps have been no socialism in the masses of the people. And it reminds me, so there's another passage that Nietzsche wrote about in Human All Too Human. It's actually book 3 of Human All Too Human, Wanderer and His Shadow. And it's a passage called The Revolution Spirit and the Possession Spirit. And, I'm thinking of a different one. It's called Danger and Wealth. And this is Human All Too Human 310. Human All Too Human book 2, 310. So I just cited it wrong twice. It's not the third book, it's the second book. But he says in this, only a man of intellect should hold property, otherwise property is dangerous to the community. And further down he says, for the owner, not knowing how to make use of the leisure which his possessions might secure to him, will continue to strive after more property. This strife will be his occupation, his strategy in the war with ennui. Such wealth, then, is the glittering outcrop of intellectual dependence and poverty, but it looks quite different from what its humble origin might lead one to expect, because it can mask itself with culture and art. It can, in fact, purchase the mask. And so that passage, and there's a lot, the reason why I got that confused, I have them all lined up, because in books 2 and 3, especially of Human All Too Human, Nietzsche makes a very similar criticism of the upper class within a capitalistic society that he's making there in The Gay Science. And so I don't necessarily read it as, well, we just need to give the lower class the impression that the people on the top are better than them, and then they won't revolt. I think what Nietzsche is saying, because he starts right out in the passage and says, warrior societies are superior to what? Industrial societies. He's saying that that basically our giving in to capitalism, not just as an economic system, but as an understanding of what makes somebody worthwhile is their success within the market. How much capital they accrue to themselves is a measure of their worthwhileness as a person, and how much power they should therefore hold over society. That's not obvious. That's an aspect of the capitalist system that didn't exist before in the aristocracies. Now, Nietzsche he's a reactionary, so he wants to go back to the aristocracies. So that, again, that element is certainly there. But I don't think he believes that we can just give people the impression that the business magnate is, oh, well, yeah, he's actually superior to you. I think what he's saying is they're not superior to you. The reason why socialism is even a problem, and he sees it as a problem because he's a reactionary, is because the upper class are garbage people. They're not, like, they don't deserve the wealth that they have. And he spells it out pretty plainly that he's like, he uses only a man of intellect because in Human All Too Human, he's kind of caught up in like that Voltaire, like French Enlightenment thing. So he thinks of like nobility as kind of bound up with the intellect. I think later he would really drill down to like, none of that matters. What matters is like being a warrior or whatever. That's all Nietzsche's opinion, basically. But I think the element of his analysis, like on the factual level, that I think is really useful, is basically saying those class distinctions were held up by an actual perception that the people of the upper class were virtuous. And the evidence that they're not virtuous is that they continue just accruing more and more wealth to themselves as their war with ennui. They're not disciplined. They don't have virtue. They don't have a deeper meaning or value structure in their lives other than just making money. And so I see it in a very, albeit in a very reactionary way, as a critique of capitalism. That he's looking at this market economy and saying, you cannot structure this society this way, where the people who are the upper class are just the people who made the most money, because that is no guarantee that they will be virtuous people. And the reason why there was a guarantee that the nobility was virtuous, and again, you don't have to agree with this, but this is Nietzsche's opinion, is the warrior aristocracies had to fight to survive. And oftentimes, and really what he's talking about the Greeks. And so many of the times he's talking about the old warrior aristocracies, it's really just the Greeks. I know he uses other examples, but the Greeks are so central to Nietzsche's just conception of like the pre-Christian, healthy society that existed in Europe before all of this nonsense that we're dealing with now. And he's looking at it as, you look at all these Greek epics, the nobility they're not just like willing to fight. They can't wait. He talks about how like they would squander their lives for just one great feeling. They would throw their whole life away to like have a wonderful moment or to be like entered into the annals of history as heroic. So the reason why I keep saying like you don't have to agree with this is because I think it's fair to say that probably wasn't true. This is probably like it's like a fantasy version of Greece from the Iliad. But so take that for what you will. But Nietzsche, I think, is saying a class system can exist when the upper class is like that, when they actually are better people, not just when they appear to be. Because as he says, they can purchase the mask, and that might like fool some people. But ultimately, because they're not virtuous, that will, in the end, from like to maybe take it away out of Nietzsche, just from like a sociological or economic or historical analysis, yeah, when you have like a parasitic upper class, they will wreck your state. That's what happens at the end of complex societies. Is you have an Christopher Lasch talks about this. Who else? Peter Turchin talks about this. Chris Hedges has spoken about this quite a bit. Who else? Quite a few intellectuals have done a lot of work on this, that as you reach the end of a complex society, the upper class becomes increasingly detached and increasingly aloof from like the concerns, while they often take the opportunity of the collapse of society to like loot the treasury. And so that is, from a Nietzschean angle, then that's not powerful. That's actually self-undermining. And so that would be kind of how I look at that. I know that was a very long answer, but I think Nietzsche actually has a very important critique of capitalism, that it's a system that doesn't guarantee that the good people, quote unquote, whatever you want to say good to mean, the capable people, again, it's funny you brought up Jordan Peterson, because this is sort of a direct rebuke to him. It's what he says is capitalism is good at, is making sure that you have a healthy hierarchy based on competence. Nietzsche would say no. And he goes into this actually in Human Ulti-Human Elsewhere, where he brings up, like, in the big stock exchanges and financial markets, people can make massive sums of money on like lucky decisions. So just right there, that there's no guarantee that the person who is like controlling all these power and resources in your society gives a shit about anyone other than themselves, or and they don't even like give a shit about themselves in like that sort of like self-legislating, powerful Nietzschean way, because they don't have anything in their inner content. They're just trying to fill it up with money all the time. So I think there's an important critique of capitalism there.
Okay. I think I jumped the gun a little bit because I forgot the reason that I brought up this aphorism. I think it was, at least in my mind, I was thinking of it, yeah, like in terms of what you were saying about, Tim Wise's speech about Trump's election, and how there's a history of rich white men riling up the white working class to destroy their interests, and fight the working class of people of other colors.
Yeah, we talked about that in chat before.
Yeah. Right? And so like when I see that kind of rhetoric, like I'm not sure quite how to get my head around it, because like I see like hostility and treachery being valorized by some people in my generation towards employers, and it creates like kind of a negative feedback loop where people are like, well, like, oh, they're just trying to like screw you over, man. Like, you should like steal and like make their lives hell kind of thing, right? And then their employers in turn will treat them even worse and, like whip them even harder into shape, right? And so I just see it as like a situation that's deteriorating further when it is framed as in like, these guys are, blood-sucking dogs, right? And when it comes to the Nietzschean quote, I just found it so interesting how like his observation is like anthropologically correct in this, like because I remember reading in Graeber's book on debt that like revolutions happen when people get the idea that there is no essential difference between human beings, which is something I mean, I kind of believe, right? Like in the sense that I don't think that people who are, kings or prime ministers are like, completely different from me in every way, that I could never be like them, right? It might be delusion on my part, but it's like, it's not something that I think, like, I don't think that there's a big gap. But then I think what Nietzsche problematizes is that, well, if you think that, then you're setting yourself up for, this horrible antagonism of just people constantly trying to like climb to the top with like no mercy because they have no respect for other people. And I see that, like, people like, eat the rich and everything like that. And I get worried because I don't see like there being an important difference between, someone at the top conning the little guy sort of, and then the people at the bottom wanting to like get revenge and, like cut all their throats, right? It could be righteous. I don't know, right? Depends on the situation, but it's like, they're just one lucky swing away from a home run. They're like one lucky circumstance away from them being kind of the enemy that they like always complained about, right? And like, like for example, and I feel like I'm ambivalent about it. I don't quite know how to wrap my head around it. But like, yeah, sorry. Go
ahead. Oh, well, the fact that they are one lucky circumstance away, though, you could say is an artifact of our current system. And I think what's implicit in what Nietzsche is saying is, well, so maybe this is a thing, because it may sound, so I'm sure there's like some like, right-wing Nietzscheans out there who's like, Saltz is being too easy on the proletarians or whatever. But I'm really not, because it depends on whether you think the populace actually has relevant power. And I'm pretty bearish on that. I don't know if they do, because it seems like, this goes back to 1984, specifically the book within the book, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Goldstein, where he says there's always been, three classes of men, the high, the middle, and the low. And the way he describes it is not the lower class one day realize that they're equal. He says eventually the middle tries to subvert the current upper class, and so they go rile up the lower class with, and this is where you hear the claims of the eternal brotherhood of men and all of these things, and then they install themselves as a new elite, and the low stay low. It's a very bleak and cynical picture of how revolutions work and how power exchanges hands. But I don't think that, so I guess in a roundabout way of saying it, I think what Nietzsche's saying is like, it's your fault. He's talking to the upper class, the rich. He's like, why are you blaming the proletarians? They don't have power. They're a disorganized mass. They're not even individuals. It's your fault for being unvirtuous. That's why there's socialism. So stop blaming, if you're boohoo, you're the billionaire and the lower class don't like you. Be more virtuous and they'll like you. But you can't do that because you're a low quality person who's accidentally found his way into this position. I mean, Jeff Bezos was there at the right time to like have the idea of selling books online. Now he's like literally lighting money on fire in the form of rocket fuel to send himself to space in a dick measuring contest with 2 other billionaires. That's not because Jeff Bezos is the most brilliant guy out there, no matter what any right-wing conservative libertarian says. And I'm not saying all the problems are Jeff Bezos. I think that's a very like simplistic way the left looks at it too. Like the problem is this man. It's really not. It's because he's just like you in our current system. He could have been, it could have been you in his position, right? Which is sort of what you're saying. Like, why are you making this guy into this devil when, like, if you were in his circumstances, you'd probably behave the exact same way? But I think that's kind of Nietzsche's point, right? Like, we have destroyed any kind of system that would actually select for someone who deserves to, like, steer the ship of state, which is more powerful than it's ever been, right? And so I think that's sort of the situation we're in now. And to say one further thing about revolutions and who causes them, that's not just like Turchin's sociological analysis basically gives a sort of mathematical approach to showing that really what destabilizes societies is the creation of a counter elite. And so what happens is, like, you have an elite class that gathers more and more wealth to itself, and you see real wages fall for the populace. But that doesn't ever lead to revolution. What leads to revolution is when the elite becomes so swollen, it's too big and there's not enough to go around. And so aspirant elites who might normally be, on the track, they go through in modern times in America, we'd say they go to all the Ivy League institutions and they get maybe a federal clerkship from a judge, but there just aren't enough judgeships available, right? Or you, like Steve Bannon is a great example of a counter elite. That's Donald Trump, in a sense, is an elite that the other elites never liked. And that's one of the things that the keen political analysts have noted as to why he appeals so much to the lower class. Is because they know they hate him just as much as they hate all of the conservative chuds or whatever. Because he's one of them kind of internally. And so I think what really destabilizes societies and leads to these revolutions is sort of a natural process of the elite grows too big, then you create a bunch of counter elites who can't get their slice of the pie, and then they lead, they take advantage of the already existing dissolution of society, and then you get a new elite. Now, the real question then from that, you could have 2 questions, would be, I guess, is Nietzsche's vision possible? Is there some system we could create that would actually select for quality people? Or you have the Marxist question. Is there some way we could have a revolution that doesn't fall victim to the counter elite coming in and just establishing a new aristocracy? I don't have the answer to either of those questions because no one does. But they're interesting to think about.
But then, like, so let's go to a practical example that I hope you can maybe like unpack for me or go over a bit, which is the strikes in West Virginia, and the rednecks. Like I found it interesting, like both as a moral problem and like as a reflection on political goals, right? To see like what role does resistance play when it comes to achieving your goals as a worker, right? Because it was extremely bloody and maybe you can introduce the idea.
Yeah, the West Virginia, well, they call it the West Virginia Mine Wars because
okay.
they dropped used aerial bombardment. I believe there were some mounted chain guns involved in some cases. And this was a series of events that happened in the context of what I would call a pre-revolutionary America. That America in the late 1800s was going through, mainly in the 1890s and then in the aughts and teens, was going through a serious economic downturn. This coincided with like a nadir of racism as well. So that got super bad when economic conditions were terrible. But also there was just peak exploitation. I mean, that was for students of U.S. history, late 1800s, typically known as the Gilded Age. That's the age when all of the, we built some of the most impressive things in America, actually. The Chicago World's Fair happened during that time, where they basically built a whole city out of nothing. There was like a replica Eiffel Tower, I think, all sorts of crazy stuff. If you've read Devil in the White City, it's all about that sort of really interesting era in American history. And I think that's when we also had a lot of inventors, and then there was like massive development and industrialization. But all of this money was accruing to the top. There were very little protections for the laborers. And most of them couldn't do anything about it. But the West Virginia mine workers, because of the geography and the nature of their work, were able to more or less actually wield power. And the way that they did this was by blocking the coal shipments from leaving the valleys. And they did this in response to a number of things. They weren't getting any health care, and obviously a coal miner's life is not the healthiest life. There's the black lung. All sorts of accidents can happen, and they typically died pretty early. And in addition to that, what else?
Sorry, just
Sorry,
just to interject.
Yeah.
Like on Wikipedia, they said that their death rate was worse than like the World War going on at the time, which is amazing to me.
Oh wow, I actually didn't know that.
Sorry, yeah,
but it doesn't surprise me because well, and then the other thing with too is just like the working conditions were not just intolerable for that reason. It was also the fact that people had to live in company towns where the company that owned the town basically provided all the services, and then even had their own money, like commissary script basically. So anything that you wanted, you got paid for in like monopoly money that you would use for the goods and services in the town. And often these towns are like, they're in the West Virginia mountains. There's not much civilization out there even today. I've been there. No offense to people in West Virginia, but they know the whole state has less of population than the city I live in. So, you're pretty far from anything else. You're dependent. They basically created a situation where they had a population completely dependent on their paternalism. And so in that situation of something approximating modern day serfdom, it makes sense that if you're not getting what you need, it's not just like free market. It's you are my patron. I need this from you. We're dying over here. And so they had that rather unique relationship, and they had a unique amount of power because they had the resource that was what the mining companies wanted, and they were able to block it. And when they did that, the companies sent in Pinkertons, their private armies, and as we mentioned, aerial bombardment, all sorts of bloodshed that happened. And the thing is, this was repeated throughout the country. So every year when I go up to Colorado to visit my family for Christmas, on I-20, I believe it is, Interstate 20, you'll pass the Ludlow Massacre Memorial.
Wow.
And I never knew what that was until I looked it up. I heard it in connection with sort of the same period of U.S. history, and came to find out, there were striking either mine or railroad workers, or no, they were mine workers. And you read about some of the things they were striking on. It was like, they didn't get paid for dead work, they called it. So like anything that wasn't, they got paid by the like amount of product they removed from the earth, right? And so if you had to do something like, well, I have to fix this trolley in order to extract the coal, it's like, well, that's just on your own dime, buddy. So all these things like that seem really reasonable, of like, we just want to get paid for the time when we're working. But the bosses were, and it was owned by the Rockefellers, and so they were like completely had the attitude of like, we don't owe you anything. And it concluded with them massacring the entire camp, basically, including like women and children. It was like 22 people died. And they were mostly, the press was like pretty hard on Rockefeller, but they didn't really get any like legal punishment for it. It was sort of like, it's the Wild West. Sometimes things happen, I guess. And so incidents like this were really common. There were a lot of riots. The 1910s were called the Violent Teens. So it was like a particularly violent time. And that's why I say it was a pre-revolutionary state. That basically, what you saw in that situation with the West Virginia mine workers. Oh, and so the rednecks. I mean, rednecks were they wore red bandanas. Those were the striking mine workers. And so today we think of rednecks as like a backwards country bumpkin. It's like been turned into a phrase for that. But back in the day, it meant red, literally the color red, and had the implication of being like a labor militant. And they were, in some cases, multiracial. There was also some cases where there was like racial hatred, like there was a lynching of Chinese railroad workers in Rock Springs, Wyoming, for example. And that's like a great example of the upper classes, I think, playing the lower classes against each other, of saying, we're going to import all of this labor that's going to undercut you and you're out of a job now. And their response is like, let's just go kill the competition. Rather than seeing that the people the owner class is really the one doing this to you, right? And so that's another way of like being manipulated directly or indirectly into fighting amongst yourselves over like associations in a way that has tragic results, rather than seeing like who really holds the power and who's really controlling the situation. But in some cases, like with the rednecks, they're black rednecks, they're rednecks of all colors. And so it wasn't like, it's just kind of a shame that now we associate it with almost like, oh, you must be like a Southern country bumpkin. And the obvious association with that is like, you're probably some white conservative. But originally these people were revolutionaries in some sense. I mean, they probably had pretty conservative views on a lot of things, like most people in the 20s and 10s would have compared to you or I today.
Mine workers.
But in terms of where the name comes from, it was labor militancy. So that's sort of the story of the West Virginia mine workers.
That's really cool. I didn't know about the Ludlow massacre. And you mentioned that like you took inspiration for this to try to like maybe gather up like-minded people who like saw the value in maybe challenging some of the conditions that people work under, right? To like maybe build a community around that. And maybe you could mention go over that.
Yeah, it was just a Discord server I started. I used the image of the red bandana, and I thought that was, I don't know, it was a time when I was really thinking, it was like kind of near. So I was like really invested in Andrew Yang's campaign for president. I thought that he was a great choice because he had this ability to speak to people about, I don't know, to cut through partisanship and like cultural gunk, like these sort of tribal cultural issues. Again, really just the same thing of people keeping the American populace divided against themselves rather than perceiving the real power structures.
The whole thing about truck drivers getting replaced and...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so that's the thing. Like, you know, he was able to speak to truck drivers who, as we know from like the Freedom Convoy protest, generally pretty conservative people, right? But there was a whole pack called Truckers for Yang. So, but even just beyond that, he had an ability beyond any one issue of automation or UBI. He had this ability to speak in terms about politics in a way that addressed real issues and was in the language that people of all stripes could understand. It wasn't pandering to anybody, wasn't browbeating anybody, wasn't shaming anybody. And I found that all of the nominally left-wing politicians, I don't really think there is an actual left, actually, but even people like Bernie Sanders, who I would say are on the left, often capitulate to this certain way of speaking, a certain suite of issues that is like ordained often by, funnily enough, Ivy League institutions who are sort of setting the left cultural agenda. And they have to like kowtow to all of this, and it makes it a non-starter for a huge swath of the country that they just don't want to hear that. And I remember thinking, man, this would be a cool sort of like symbol or like movement or idea to like draw on from the past. That's like, this is very American. it's, they're called the rednecks. Like, what's not to like about that if you're from the South or whatever? But also, it does something which left-wingers really enjoy, which is retconning history. I shouldn't even say retconning, but reimagining or reinterpreting our history in a way, because that allows you, it satisfies, I think, the left temperamental need to have like an unorthodox take, right? That, hey, actually, you think that your grandparents were super conservative, so the generation before them must have been even more conservative than that. But look out, actually, their great grandparents were more than likely. I mean, if you look at the numbers of communists, card-carrying communists that were in the United States, a significant number of our great grandparents and great great grandparents were probably communists or associated with some sort of movement like that. So really, the most traditional American thing you can do is to, be for like labor militancy and like breaking up these like monopolies and challenging these power structures and so on and so forth. Problem with that is I realized the premise was wrong. The premise I was operating from is wrong. You will never create that movement online because people who are online are not there to do activism. They're just not. People who are hanging out in Discord servers are there for entertainment because that's what it is. And that's the problem with all political entertainment, whether it's Chapo Trap House or, Dave Rubin or Sam Cedar, or even people I very much enjoy like Jimmy Dore. That there may be a value to it. I'm not going to deny that there's no like value to getting people to think about these issues in a different way. But that's not where the movement will come from, I don't think. Any kind of movement. Because it naturally takes all of your energy for doing things in the real world and turns it into it pours it into this digital world. And so I kind of realized that at a certain point, online isn't going to do it. That's not like real activism. And I don't have the stomach for real activism. So it was sort of like that was fun. But I don't know if this is for me.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned activism because, like your band's hit song, Into the Smoke, right? By Destroyer of Light, right? Mm-hmm. That's your band name? Mm-hmm. Right? So Into the Smoke, like to me, I don't know if you could exactly call it political activism, but it's like, I feel like it's kind of an important thing for people with like an artistic platform to give like good messages to people listening to them. Like I know that's not necessarily a popular thing to say, but like because I highly recommend people watch this video. I'll link it in the show notes, but it's like it's showing like the dark side of like weed culture, right? And
yeah.
And I kind of had this like naive view of people who are into weed as being like kind of spiritually inclined or using it as a way to like expand their consciousness and stuff. But often that is not the case at all. It's just like a sort of like self-destructive hedonism, which it's like it's hard to package that message in a way that is palatable, right? Like you don't want to be
doesn't feel like it's a Dare commercial from the 80s.
Exactly. That doesn't have like a religious tone to it. And I really like how your band turned it into like something really punchy and fun and funny, right? Like it's not like it makes it a poetic expression rather than like, you guys shouldn't do this. It just like shows you like, look, this is the kind of person you are, right, or are on the road to becoming. And I think because it's done through music, people will like, kind of like rock out to it and just be like, oh, maybe I should reconsider what I'm doing. Although like,
well, there's,
yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on. Oh, well, I was just going to say it's actually, well, so it's funny you put it like that. So And maybe so there's definitely like a Jungian sort of synchronicity thing that it is involved with the story of the song. Because when I wrote, so that's one of mine, and when I wrote that, it wasn't really, I didn't think it was about weed. Because the actual content of the lyrics is about it's about a smoke monster. It's sort of like Lovecraft. I had a Lovecraftian idea of somebody going into like this ancient like mine or tomb in a cave, and they're like a sentient monster made out of smoke basically like seeps into them, and you become like a zombie filled with smoke that it's like cursed to have a bad trip for all time. Now that sounds like a metaphor though.
That's what I thought it was. Yeah.
When I look back on it now and how I was like abusing weed at the time, basically, I realized, because I was like in a really kind of like shitty part of my life actually. And I was like reading a lot of Lovecraft. And so that's like what came out. But then what came out is like a very clear allegory to like a dependency on a substance. What's funny about that is then the video production company, they came up with the whole concept. So they could have done something like related to like a smoke monster or shot a bunch of smoke or whatever, but they interpreted it in that way that actually the lyrics of the song actually sort of metaphorically describe what they ended up showing quite literally on the screen. And so that was interesting because like we know the guys in the Three Goats Moving Pictures, and that was their concept. And we were on tour when that video was made. That was because, you know, it's in a grocery store. How do we film in a grocery store? Well, too, yeah. It's at 4 a.m. And it was after a day of recording like our EP after driving, you know, like we were in the middle of like a huge tour. So we spent all day recording. And I remember I was like, all right, when it's time for me to come in and play guitar for the video, I'll be in there. I'm going to go to sleep in the van. And so that's kind of why we all look tired and haggard, but I think it like works for the subject matter as well. But so, yeah, like I said, it's kind of maybe some Jungian synchronicity there, because it does end up basically saying something, which I do believe, and I've probably come to believe more strongly, that, yeah, this will trap you. Like, it's like any other, people often will say, why are we so down in marijuana? It's really no different from alcohol. And it's like, if you drank the amount of alcohol equivalent to the amount of weed that you smoke, you would be called an alcoholic. And we don't like that. We don't look kindly on that in society either. So I feel like a lot of arguments that were used to sort of promote legalization, which I do agree with, are then deployed anytime somebody has like a problem, like possibly addictive problem, as like no, it's just like, you wouldn't shame somebody for drinking alcohol. It's like, well, if they were drinking the amount of alcohol equivalent to the weed you're smoking, yeah, I would. And so I think there's a lot of unhealthy views on marijuana that are like a hangover from legalization. And here in America, the reason why it's still really difficult is because it's not fully legal like it is up in the Canada, that we still, in my state and many other states, you know, there's probably will never be legal, I would say.
Wow. I mean, actually, like if there was one political goal that I felt really strongly about, was the legalization of weed, just because like
it's a no-brainer.
Oh, okay. And it's a no-brainer. And also, like, I just, like, in terms of alleviating stuff like nausea and pain, it's just so much better than a lot of what exists, right? And, like, I remember before legalization, they would have to do these weird, like, lab tricks where they'd have to, like, isolate it and, like, change it in a way so that you don't feel any, like, euphoria. Or, like, they had to just, like, change it and, like, ruin its effect.
It's not pleasant. this this has to be unpleasant for it to be
Yeah.
medicine.
I think there's like a sort of like puritanical streak that people have where it's like if medication makes you feel good while you're taking it, it's bad. Like I noticed that with like anesthetics. Like I felt amazing after Demerol, but because Demerol is so addictive and makes you feel so good, they had to like change it a little bit to make it more neutral. But yeah, so sorry, I got off track. So I was saying like it's a political goal that I really cared about, and one of the reasons I'm still like loyal to Trudeau, because like he actually made one of the biggest impacts in my personal life, where like now I can buy this stuff online without going to meet some like tattooed chick in front of the mall and like secretly hand her money. It was like this ridiculous like hiding, and they're even bringing in stuff like CBN, like finding out these like new components of the plant. But like I wonder, when you tried to start this community like for rednecks, like rednecks,
Right.
what, like, did you have any particular political goal in mind, or were you just like kind of trying the sort of Andrew Yang thing of like no pandering, no shaming, like focused on problem solving? So it was like specific or general, I guess.
Yeah. How do I put this? I think on some level it is that, because, well, so I think there is this perception among, what would we say? I don't want to just say like the capitalists, because it's not really them. There's like an ideological defensiveness against any kind of like redistribution of wealth as being socialist. Even though it's not. That's like maybe an element of Marxism, but distributism is actually, and especially the way Yang talked about it, that is like a subset of liberal democratic capitalism. Like having a welfare state, having the idea that we're going to let this market go and generate all this wealth and all this technological power and innovation. But we're not just going to let it like increasingly accrue to the top, to a smaller and smaller percentage of people. We are going to scrape some off the top and make sure that we like restabilize society. It's basically, I mean, you can think about it in literal terms as a metaphor. You're like eroding the foundations and like, or not even that, you're like chipping away at the foundations and stacking more on top. That's going to collapse.
Right.
You're dead. Like, and so it's basically just like a sane version of capitalism. And so in a way, it's actually rather counter-revolutionary. So Marxists might have a problem with that. But like a Andrew Yang style distributism, well, in the same way, FDR said, I have saved capitalism. He didn't say I'm bringing communism, because if America was the anarchist socialist Giuseppe, I forget his name, but the guy who tried to shoot FDR in the 30s, there were a lot of like Italian anarchists in America, and there was an assassination attempt that FDR survived.
Wow,
and it was
I didn't know that.
because he hated capitalists and knew that what FDR was doing was going to preserve capitalism for another century, which it did. And so this reflexive sort of fear of any kind of attempt to like make your system sane and stable is, I mean, you could argue, to bring it back to Nietzsche again, that's further evidence of the depravity and low quality of the ruling class today. That these people have no foresight, and that the whole system's built on short-term gains, and that there's a reason why they all have invested in like bunkers and super yachts, and like if society collapses, the super rich are gonna try and do their best to make sure they don't have to die, or have their wealth taken from them. They'll just abscond. Like the multinational system of trade and international finance has created basically sort of a rootless elite. who have no loyalty to any individual people or nation or country, or even like to really anything, like anything but themselves, right? Like they're plutocrats. And so in that situation, it sort of makes sense that they don't care to create a saner, more stable system. And so I guess contained in that idea then is the idea that we would need to have some sort of, maybe this is like the compromise between like Nietzsche and Marx, have some sort of like ability to have leadership that actually cares about or identifies with the people that they represent, because it's very obvious to me that that doesn't resemble anything we have now. And I saw somebody like Yang as maybe potentially being that person. I now, when I look back on it, like in how the US system of government works, even that was kind of very naive of me. But at least like by, in the way that FDR did, showing that certain things are possible, or putting a salve on the system, maybe that it's both progressive and conservative at the same time, right? Because you're preserving the current system, but you're also showing, you're setting the precedent, this can be done. Like if Yang's UBI had been passed, so the reason why that will never happen is because it would set the precedent that you can do that. We can just, we can just take money off every transaction, and we can just give you money as sort of a unit of social trust. Like, we trust you as a person to go make these decisions in the market, which is really what money is giving somebody a measure of power over how resources move and are distributed in the economy, goods and services. And we basically, the current system says, you get that as part of a contract with a private individual who owns it, according to how much you work for them, or really whatever they say. This would be saying, yeah, that's still true, but up to a certain point, we'll take care of you. Like, you're not going to be on the street. You're not going to starve. But it would set the precedent that we can do that. And I think that's why there's an opposition to it. It's not because the elites actually think, that would destroy society. I think they kind of know that would like save our society. But it would set such a dangerous precedent for us getting our grubby plebeian hands on their wealth. And that's why it drew me so much to the West Virginia mine war, because it's like, to use an example from history, it's like a Roman plebiscite, or not plebiscite, like a plebeian secession, not succession. So in the time of the Republic, occasionally the plebeian class would just leave. Like, they did all the productive work, and on, I think, 3 or 4 different occasions, they would just, okay, everyone, I mean, it's a strike. They said, everyone, let's pick up and leave and just go to a nearby city and stop doing any work. And these were also, so not only were they the productive farmers, they were who they drew on for military service. Mm. So it scared the shit out of the patricians. And that was the only time the plebeians ever got anything, was when they did that.
Wow.
It wasn't because, somebody, I mean, or you could say like somebody like Caesar or Marius occasionally did some things to like, in the same way, like you might say FDR or a potential future person like Andrew Yang could have done to like mitigate the system. But the only time they ever gained like any political power was when they did these plebeian secessions. That's how they got the office of the tribune of the plebs, which was like an actual office to represent plebeian interests in Roman government. And that was sort of what I was looking at. I was like, that's really what we need, is like a modern day plebeian secession. But again, you run into that problem that kind of realizing the humility a little bit. I'm not going to be the one who does this. I'm not going to be the one who leads that. So
I'm not so sure about that, but when you come to this conclusion that, I mean, it's kind of funny when like people who are online are just kind of like chilling out, looking for entertainment. I think it's an accurate statement, and like even from an observational point of view, right? Like people are just kind of at home sitting around. They might be looking at different things, but they are just kind of like sitting down looking at stuff. But like, I mean, sometimes I feel really engaged, like when I'm on Discord or Reddit or something. Like it means a lot to me what I'm saying and like what is being said to me. It's just that like it's so hard to like necessarily translate that into like building an actual community, because people are like just scattered across the world, right? And I was also thinking like how you actually like build a sense of loyalty between people. Like it's very hard, right? Especially since like with online, especially if people are in different time zones and stuff like that, like there isn't like like, you know, like for church, like you have to show up on Sundays at 10:30 or something, right? It doesn't matter how you feel, like that's just how when you're supposed to be there, right? And there's like these things that like encourage positive emotions, right? Like music, right? And so like as a musician, I'm sure you've had that, what I imagine must be like a magical experience of like a huge crowd of people all having like a benevolent gaze on you and your bandmates, right? Which is like, that's an amazing thing, right? Instead of getting them to think, you know, 100 different opinions, right? They're just like, this is great. We're together. We're enjoying this. And so I feel like as a musician, you have like an unusual access to like rallying people to a common cause. Although I don't think that like Destroyer of Light has like any political agenda.
Yeah, not really. Well, so the thing about that is that I think music it's inextricably linked with like a religious sort of experience. It's always historically been has a religious origin, really, I would argue.
Wow.
I think all art has a religious origin, or I think that the further back you go in time, the more inseparable the concepts of art and religion are, to where all of the religious content is artistic and all of the artistic content is religious. And so they're kind of the same thing. But music has this Dionysian element to it, as Nietzsche said, because it's the type of art that is supposed to sort of give you rapture and give you these strong emotional experiences. It's not contemplative, right? Like looking at an Eastern Orthodox icon or the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That's totally different from, you know, a Cannibal Corpse song. But what would you say? So I think that every ideological movement, especially political movements, have utilized art and music to sort of bring people in to the same mind state or a shared emotional reality. You know, singing together is wonderful for like a bonding experience. So it's like, why does the military have, you know, the stereotype of everyone's jogging together and doing the I don't know what I've been told, and they really do that, but that's because it's not just for fun. Like having everyone sing together gives them sort of like this mutual bond, even if it's like that seems, you know, that probably seems like too easy or whatever, right? But even just the act of doing it has that effect. I would also think of, you know, Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Sheng, and her revolutionary plays that reimagined traditional Chinese operas into stories about communist revolution and the workers like rising up. So, and that was what, just prior to the Cultural Revolution, Jiang Sheng would go out and give talks to like all the Red Guards, and they would watch her revolutionary operas, and then they would go out and like go and beat up all the old, like, because the Cultural Revolution was the whole thing. We need to root out all the counter-revolutionaries in the institutions. Before they would go do that, they would get all juiced up on their on art, right? The original drug, like we could say the kamikazes used methamphetamines, the Nazis used methamphetamines during their blitzkriegs, the Chinese during the Cultural Revolution used art. It's at least as potent. So there is that I have kind of had to grapple with, that there is like a serious power to art that we kind of tend to underestimate in modern times. And it's weird because we often will like wax poetic about like, oh, art is so powerful and it can change your life. But like, if you really take that seriously, then you have to reckon with like the position of Socrates, who basically says, if we let the poets just write whatever they want, they're going to have people in all sorts of messed up mind states. They're going to become lachrymose and dour if we let them write tragic, sad sounding music all the time. And so I've kind of dealt with that from the angle of like, well, what am I doing? I'm making doom metal, which is like tragic, melancholic music, about like accepting your death and accepting your doom, right? So is that really like a healthy thing that I'm putting out there? Isn't that like the opposite of anything that's going to like motivate someone to an optimistic like view of things? And I think, how do I put it? I think it's entirely possible. So like punk rock, a lot of political messaging there. And I think the music did have power to like rally people and get them all in for like a certain political message, or whatever it might be. I mean, obviously like in the 80s, like it was big, like a lot of anarchists and anti-establishment people. I think what would I say? I think the reason why I've never really done anything political with my music, though, is because on some level, I don't really want that responsibility. And on another level, just the style that I'm playing, I think doesn't really lend itself to that. It's kind of funny because and when you were talking about earlier on Discord about like, the whole thing of like, is it just entertainment or does it really have an effect on the world? Which is kind of what I guess we're exploring with music, right? I find that when I'm most, what would you say, being like positively affected by something on Discord that isn't just mere entertainment, it's really more of an artistic or intellectual nature. It's something of a meeting of the minds, of a discussion about something interesting. It's not necessarily because, or I don't know if it's ever been because like I converted someone to my like ideology or whatever. It's not really like what I get out of it, right? And I think similarly with music, maybe that's kind of how I approach it. Like, these are just sort of like little stories or little like pieces of myself of a certain way I felt at a certain time that you can kind of experience. So there's not really anything radical or political about it. It's really on some level more important than that, I think, because I don't have kids, and so the way I'm reproducing is like artistically and intellectually, and it's getting people to like resonate with you on like some deep feeling that you felt is, to me, like that living on in someone else's heart and head is in some way more important to me than getting them to agree with a political motive. And then, and I have to say, when I do look back on it, like punk rock, for example, I don't know if that necessarily ever led to anything, right? I mean, it was super revolutionary, but like the 80s were like the Reagan Revolution. And then we went into like the 90s and the Clinton Revolution. And, the whole like naivete of the end of history. And punk rock ended up being a very like, individualist ideology of like, express yourself in this really conformist way, for one, which is always a paradox people always bring up, but it's all about self-expression, right? And anarchism's really individualist. It's the idea that we don't need these collective powers. You just be you. And so what did that do to challenge all the stuff that the punk rockers hate? Was there anarchy in the UK? No. So
They haven't reached that goal yet. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned like like I mean Zizek in one of his movies he talks about like that strange um, mm, like malleability of purpose for music. Like he brings up the scene in Chaplin's movie where he's like dressed up as Hitler, and there's this like really beautiful orchestral music
Is
playing.
it the dictator?
Yeah, yeah, and he's like playing with like a globe, and it's like graceful and beautiful, but then like the actual substance or content is like horrible, right? Because he's like representing someone, um, like sort of nonchalantly treating the world like his toy, basically, and yeah, like it, like I think you phrase it well. Like it takes a lot of responsibility to start introducing politics into your music, because then like you're kind of on the hook for its effects, I guess, in a way. Although I guess you also already feel like somewhat ambivalent about the content you're putting out, even if it is personal, right? Because like you are influencing people's mind states, and making them feel a certain way, right? Like I wonder how like Nirvana kind of like reinforces people's you know sense of like misery and gloom. Although
Right.
like his like his what is it, his like unplugged session, um yeah, I don't know, like I feel like when I got older and like I listened to Nirvana again, like his unplugged work, like Cobain's unplugged work, um I feel like I can connect to his pain more directly, whereas like the studio work of Nirvana is like a bit glossier and
Yeah, so there's debate about that between Plato and Aristotle, and I can't remember which one takes which position at the moment. I think it's that Plato thinks, yeah, I think it's that Plato in his work basically says you should be really careful with like tragedy because it'll make people sad. And Aristotle's view is no, tragedy will be a catharsis, and it will actually help them vent their sadness. And so I think about that often with bands like Nirvana, or even with like what we're doing. It's kind of how I've like come to grips with it. It's like obviously people need this, or they enjoy this, and hopefully it's not just like dragging people down into like darkness. Hopefully they're like sort of like releasing something, and then they can be better off from that. That's like at least what I hope. And or like the way Nietzsche says, the thought of suicide is like a powerful remedy that can get one through many a bad night. And so maybe that particularly applies to Nirvana, or like people like Elliott Smith, or other favorites of suicidal people who also commit suicide.
hits of the suicidal. But like as a musician, when you look at bands like like Radiohead, like jumping from OK Computer to Kid A, right? Like that seemed to me
sometimes literally jumping around the way Tom York dances.
Right, yeah, like physically jumping. Like do you feel like that's a part of you, right? Do you feel like it's a part of you that like you're kind of looking at these other genres, or you want to experiment, but like maybe because it's hard to I don't know, like gain traction with your fans, because you've already established like a fan base of people who like this particular stuff. And I figured like unless you're gigantic like Radiohead, you can't just like willy-nilly start shifting around what you produce, right?
On the one hand, I don't feel any obligation to keep to a certain genre. On the other hand, there's only so much. Like I kind of really do believe in like play to your strengths, and so it's so for example, like on the two albums we recorded over the pandemic, we incorporate a lot more like actually 80s influences and like new wave bands, trying to get a lot of that in the guitar sound and some of the song structures. Even we did a lot more clean material, so we have branched out recently, and none of the material's out yet, but we've kind of tried to push the limits. And actually that's been something we have heard in feedback from like the critics, is that as far as like, because the doom stoner metal genre is very homogenous. There are very many bands who sound more or less exactly like Black Sabbath and will never sound like anything different. And for a certain like part of the fan base, that's fine. Like that's the whole appeal. Is like we're stuck in the 70s. Cool. I get bored with that after like a little while, and that's kind of where we're at now, is branching out. But on the other hand, I don't really have the desire to do like a kid A, like throw people for a loop type thing, because I'm not sure. I mean, maybe like I have thought about doing something like acoustic or piano or kind of folksy. I couldn't see myself like delving into like the electronica type of thing. But I guess really your question is like, do I feel an obligation? And no, I don't. Not like because the old material will always be there for people who enjoy it, and if they like it, then they like it because it came out of our minds and our soul, or whatever you want to say. So hopefully they would be open to experimentation, right? In reality, not everyone is. You can lose the audience, but I feel like the moment you start thinking about like what people will like, and that enters into your like whole like calculus of what you're doing, you're fucked. Like you're not gonna make good stuff. So I guess that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, fair enough. So like, are you gonna be releasing these this year, or the two albums you said you recorded? Is that like coming up this year?
One will probably come out this year. I think the next one will be next year. There's like several things that have to line up. They're both being mixed at the same time. They were both recorded at the same time, and then they were all written basically starting from summer of 2020 through the summer of 2021, or spring of 2021, when all touring was canceled, all shows were canceled, and live music, sort of disappeared. I mean, there were some events happening in Austin at like venues that had large outdoor areas for people to be, but it really wasn't. It's hard to explain, because I would hear, so my parents are huge, how do I characterize it? Well, they're anti-vaxxers, right? They never believed the pandemic was real from the beginning. So they were always saying like, when are you going to get out and play music again? And I'd kind of have to be like, well, Mom, like, even if I wanted to do that, which I really didn't want to do in like 2020, we did play like 3 shows in 2021. But I was like, even if I wanted to do that, it's not the same. Like, people are not coming out, and people are, they're distant from each other. They're wearing masks. People are not really seeming like they're having a good time. It's almost like they're doing it because they feel like, oh, I just want to get out of the house and do something. But then they're on edge the whole time. And I don't know. It just wasn't, it seemed like everything that I enjoy about like live music was sucked out of it. So I'm not going to go get this, the weak tea version of live music just to have something. But I guess for them it was like, oh, you should do it just to stick it to the man, but it's like, you really want an audience to be there, and it's not, you're really sticking it to them, right? Because in Texas here, once we got into 2021, there's no like restrictions really.
Right.
I mean, nominally there were some on the local level, but we could have done any amount of events we wanted to. But we didn't, because the demand wasn't there, and it just wouldn't have made sense. Like, you're not going to make people feel comfortable going out when they don't. So we kind of, we just took the time to write. That was the only thing we could do, and that it was very strange, because for the past 8 years of my life before that, I had spent so much time on the road and playing shows and all of that. It was a regular feature of my life for all of those years. And so the past 2 years have been, in some sense, very strange. And so we took, it was very Nietzsche in some way. Like, just, okay, this is the situation. What is the best thing we can do with this? Not so we don't regret this, like, past, 2 years. And it was the one thing we can really do is write. And so we did. So, and then a couple bands released albums, like, even last year, thinking things are going to get going again. And I'm kind of glad we really took our time, because I think our albums are going to come out like as this 1-2 punch, like right when things are really starting to get going again. So I hope it actually, I think we judoed the pandemic into like being perfect for us. So, yeah.
And I mean, the podcast, I guess, started from this forced seclusion as well, or isolation.
Yeah, I would not have done the Nietzsche podcast if COVID-19 didn't happen. So
that's pretty Nietzschean, right?
That's another thing. Like, we can like lament that this happened, or we can just accept that it happened and be thankful for all of the good things that happened that wouldn't have happened if not for this bad thing. And it's easy to say that, but people do have a lot of trouble with it, and I have trouble with it myself. But I don't really, the great regrets in my life, I didn't really get over them until I accepted that the way that my life is now and the good things that have happened to me, good in my own subjective sense, to any of the philosophy sticklers out there, who are going to ask, what is good? All of the wonderful things to me that have happened that wouldn't have happened without whatever X, Y, or Z I did that I regret, or that I didn't do as well as I could have, or an opportunity I missed, or things not working out the way I thought they would or wanted them to. It really is. I think I've talked about it on the podcast, but I think it's one of the most practical teachings Nietzsche has, is the amor fati idea, that realizing that every joy you have in your life, everything you like, is all so like bound up with the quote unquote bad and the regrettable stuff. And you can't ask for one without the other. And once you really embrace that, and so I've realized, like, in all the things in my life that I really regretted, didn't really get over them until I accepted, oh yeah, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have done this. So
that's a very positive message to end on. Is there anything you'd like to plug?
Sure. You can go listen to the Nietzsche podcast on Spotify or Anchor or Apple Podcasts. If you search for the Nietzsche Podcast, you can look up Untimely Reflections. But it should pop. And that releases every week on Tuesday. I'm going to try and keep it going while I go on tour. So I guess that's another thing. We're going to the West Coast. So this will be our first tour in 2 years. And we're playing a show with Monolord in Austin on the 22nd, and then leaving the next day. And so if you live out west, anywhere west of Austin, Texas, we might be coming to your town. So, go and type in Destroyer of Light. And you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and all that stuff.
Cool. So Nietzsche Podcast. And of course, I think it's great. I'm really happy that you did it. I learned a lot. So it's every week on Tuesday. Destroyer of Light for tour dates on Google.
Right. And I'm going to try and pre-record episodes so that they're still coming out. I don't know if I'm going to make it to because I basically need to have, because I'm not going to have time after we get back probably to write a full episode. So I basically need to have 4 episodes front loaded, and a lot goes into them. So we'll see. There might be a Q&A episode or something kind of a little bit more low effort in there to add it out.
Let's call it improvisatory. Improvised.
Yeah. That. I agree.
Yeah.
High effort improvisation is what you'll get.
I like that. HFI. No, wait. HEI. Sorry. Anyway.
If you have HEI, let your doctor know and get this prescription.
Possible side effects include getting trolled. So
right.
really appreciate you doing this, and really happy with the podcast. And of course, thanks for having me on. And yeah, of course, I'm guessing whoever's watching this knows, but like you moderate the Nietzsche subreddit, which I think is sometimes extremely good. One of my favorite communities on the internet. Sometimes extremely good.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have like crazy people ruining it, but that's with everything. So, and it's cool.
There's a very high number of crazies among the self-selected participants of the Nietzsche forum. Crazy in all sorts of ways, including good ways.
Including good ways, I agree.
I'm one of them. So, because who else would you have to be a little crazy to spend the amount of time reading Nietzsche that I have? So,
yeah, and to like go online and start like specifically search it out and put effort into communicating it with people. But I think it's got some really good posts, and it's pretty welcoming if you behave. So as I think people should. Anyway, yeah, thanks again, man. And
thank you, Andrei.
Hopefully we can do this again some other time. Good luck on your tour and everything. Thanks for watching or listening, and smash that like and subscribe, because if you don't, I will cry.